Hello, AP World History. Welcome to Chapter 37, Part 1. This will be the first part of many parts as we look at the end of empire across the world. Now, as we know from previous chapters, that Europe and the United States, in their own different ways, colonized various parts of the globe. And we'll begin today by looking at India and Vietnam. Later on, we'll look at Africa, and we will also have some documentaries that you'll be watching throughout this chapter. So let's talk about India, the coming of self-rule in India. Now, as we know, India was a jewel of the British crown. There were many troops that helped India, or Britain rather, during World War II. And after World War II and after that conflict was over, Indian nationalism had been increasing for quite a long time, but after World War II and the disruption of that, there's increasing Indian nationalism and the idea that India should become independent from Great Britain. Now you can see here, this is all considered India at the time period that we're talking about here before what is called partition. But let's talk about the two different ideas that came with Indian nationalism and the idea of an independent India. One of them was called communalism. This was promoted by Nehru and Gandhi. They were both leaders in India. They had a pretty big public following. They were both Hindu. They really wanted to keep India together as one country and believed that India could overcome its differences between Muslims and Hindus. However, there were a large group of people who were separatists. Muhammad al-Jinnah was one of them. He formed something called the Muslim League, and in this he calls for a separate Muslim state. And the reason why is that being the minority religion by quite a bit actually in India, he believed that Hindus would be favored over Muslims, and in fact that Muslims would be persecuted by Hindus. So there are a couple of things that happened that were quite important as we work towards looking at the end of India as united, but as actually separating into two different countries, India and Pakistan. The Day of Direct Action occurred on August 16th, 1946. You're going to watch a video tomorrow called The Day India Burned. You're going to watch part of it, and you will see that this was a time of great violence. So I would like to warn you that some of it is graphic and there was definitely violence involved. There were riots that killed about 5,000 people, and it really just got out of control. It was like a mob mentality. But what happened is that it did lead, first of all, in 1947, the British said, that's it, we're done. We're going to be out of India by 1948 completely. And even on the Day of Direct Action, the British troops held back and they didn't go in and try to help calm the problems. In 1947, then the partition occurred, which was fully backed by Great Britain. And so we have Muslim Pakistan in the Northwest, and then we have Hindu and Sikh India. Now, remember, the Sikh was a syncretic faith that combined elements of both Hinduism and Islam. And you might know Sikhs, one of the things that they do not do is cut their hair. So oftentimes they wear them up in a bun with a cover on top. When the partition occurred, and this was approved by the UN, this was a rapid forced migration that followed that from beginning August 14th to 15th of 1947. The accounts of this are simply horrifying, actually. In this picture, we see cars just completely loaded with people and belongings. Hindus moving from Pakistan down to India, Muslims moving from India up to Pakistan. This would leave both countries with up to 10 to 12 million refugees. There are accounts that I've read in my lifetime of children or babies who couldn't keep up with the journey by foot, and they were just left on the side of the road and perished. It was a very difficult time. Now, the Bandung Conference was an important conference that occurred in Indonesia in 1955. Now, a lot of people know the term third world. We use that a lot of times when we talk about countries that are less well developed, or what we now call developing nations. But the term third world or third path actually came from this conference in Indonesia, and it was a conference of non-aligned country. countries. In other words, these countries were not aligned either with the USSR or with the USA and its Western allies, and they wanted to take a third path and sort of form their own alliance together to have some kind of power in the world over the two superpowers. So Indian democracy then will flourish. This is a little bit later on in chapter 37, but will flourish under Indira Gandhi, actually. It was not related to Mohandas Gandhi, but she was related to Nehru, his close associate. She was considered to be a very good leader in India, and also at this time, something called the Green Revolution occurred. The Green Revolution was merely a technology that was developed to increase crop yields. Green Revolution technology was used all over the world, but in India it was especially important because the population was so large in India. However, there were repressive policies also put in place in India to slow population growth, and this included forced sterilization of some people. Indira Gandhi was assassinated by Sikh bodyguards. So what happened is that the Sikh extremists were in Amritsar in 1984. This was the same place that the Amritsar massacre took place when the British fired on the Hindus that were having a peaceful demonstration. So the Sikhs were meeting in Amritsar. They were attacked by the Hindus, and then the Sikh bodyguards assassinated Indira Gandhi as kind of a revenge move. We'll talk a little bit more about India later on in chapter 38. As it turns out, Mohandas Gandhi was also assassinated. All right, let's take a look at Vietnam. Now, I will put a link to a longer History Channel article about Vietnam on our Schoology page. Vietnam is very complex, and there are a lot of moving parts. A lot of people were interested in Vietnam. Vietnam actually had gone under in Japanese control during World War II. Prior to that, it had been a French colony. And so after World War II, the French government comes in and they try to reassert control in Vietnam. Now, at the time, Vietnam was a unified country, so we see both the pink and the, I don't know, I guess you'd call it olive green, were one country. Now, Ho Chi Minh is a communist leader, and the French were not communists. They did not want to have a communist Vietnam. He mounts a guerrilla warfare in Vietnam, and he defeats the French in 1954. And they pull out of Vietnam. So here's where it gets a little bit murky. So you may recall that North Korea was given control by communists and South Korea by the West, the USA and her allies after World War II. So now we have Vietnam coming under the control of communists, and the world community, the two superpowers, the USA, USSR, were not really happy about Vietnam becoming completely communist. So the Geneva Conference convenes in 1954, and it is determined that Vietnam will be divided at the 17th parallel. The northern part, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and you maybe notice that a lot of communist places call themselves democratic, even though they aren't in the sense that we think of democracy. And this is very much like Korea being divided at the 38th parallel, with a demilitarized zone in the in the 17th parallel, just look at the 38th in Korea. The state of Vietnam will be in the south, and that will be supported by the West and by the U.S. So the Civil War begins between the North and a group called the Viet Minh will attack the South, and this begins in the early 1960s. Now, as early as the Kennedy administration, Kennedy sent people over to assess the situation and decided that the U.S. needed to get involved because of that, what doctrine? Oh, yeah, the Truman Doctrine. So the Truman Doctrine is all about that idea of containment. Lyndon Johnson in 1968 or so dramatically increased U.S. troop involvement in Vietnam. And the idea was to actually have Vietnam, to take over all of Vietnam and make Vietnam a democracy. So over 58,000 US troops were deployed. Over 3 million people died in this war that lasted a very, very long time. The war finally ended after Richard Nixon was voted president, and one of his campaign promises was that he would end US involvement in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was not going well for the US. First of all, there were tremendous human rights abuses that were taking place on all fronts. There were villages that soldiers thought were safe, and then they weren't, and then they came to, soldiers started massacring innocent people. There's something called the My Lai Massacre that is studied in American history. And when the soldiers came home, it was nothing like the victory march that the World War II soldiers had coming home. Many of them were really, really, even like spit upon. They were treated horribly, and the U.S. troops really, really were severely traumatized by this type of war. It was not a conventional war. It wasn't anything like World War II in that respect. Now, Cambodia and Laos were also really important parts of the conflict going on in Southeast Asia. We are not going to talk about them right now. You will talk about all of this later on. But what happens is that the communist troops get down through South Vietnam, and finally the U.S. Withdraws their troops completely in 1973 with the last helicopters of people coming out of Vietnam and heading to the U.S. We have several immigrants in the Twin Cities that came from Vietnam because of their help with U.S. troops in the Vietnam War, and this is why they were given passage to the United States, because of their assistance. The North takes over the South easily in 1975. The South had tried to stave off the North taking over completely, but they were not able to do it, and Vietnam was united in 1976 as a communist nation. I think overall, the conflict in Vietnam is one that history books take a look at and say this really, really was just a tragic war. Every war is tragic, but this one in particular was so different. It was so difficult. It led to just a really bad situation for so many civilians and soldiers alike. As my dad always said, even though he fought in South Korea, and the South Koreans are thankful for that. And whenever my dad heard of or talked about war, he cried. So thank you for your attention today, and be looking for the day that India burned and some questions to answer for tomorrow's lesson. Good night.